So hi. So this panel is on enterprise leading policy change. I'm really glad that you're here because one of the things I think people forget is that the way that women are treated in the workforce bleeds over into everything else, everything from how children's education and how children are raised to economic development across a country. So now, of course, corporate diversity programs are all the rage in the news. Everyone is talking about them. But one question we have to ask about them is, are they really effective? And what programs really are effective? Or are they just kind of well-intentioned noise? When you look at the companies like Google and Facebook who are putting out annual kind of diversity reports on how well they're progressing with women in management, women in their workforce in general, women in the technology roles, the change is pretty slow. The progress is there, but very minimal. And then you look at a company like Uber, who actually is doing better by some of the numbers than Facebook or Google, though of course we know that those numbers hide a lot. So the panelists today are awesome. They're from industry, they're from the government, they're from the military, and what we're going to hear from them is what are their organizations doing to increase diversity and improve the role of women, and how it's working, and also how you're going to benefit or how you are benefiting or can. So just to introduce everyone, to my right is Leja Speck. She is a commander select at, and Director of Military Programs at NASA Ames. She's also taught as an adjunct faculty member at universities and colleges all over the country. To her right is Sherry Burns-Haber, and she is the Senior Manager of Global Accessibility at McDonald's Corporation. Now, what some of you may not know, or let me ask a question, how many of you know that McDonald's is actually incredibly active in diversity programs? It's surprising, huh? But Sherry will tell you a lot more, I think. And to her right is Anar Simpson. She is a special advisor, Office of the Chair, Women, Girls, and Technology at Mozilla. And she can tell you what that means, I think. But she's also the deputy of the UN High Panel for Women's Economic Empowerment. So we're going to get started. What we'll do is we'll have about 20 minutes of panel discussion, and then we'll save about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Unless you can't stand it, and if you start jumping up and down and waving your arms because you really have to ask, we can always stop. Okay, so I think the first thing we want to talk about is just, I want to ask the panelists, what are your companies doing to increase opportunities for women, and where do you feel like these programs have been really effective, both inside your companies, but also how they've affected kind of the broader ecosystem where you're operating.
Good morning. Very excited to be here. So I represent, I'm part of, not necessarily representing because that would be public affairs, but I am here as a Navy person and a NASA person, and both these agencies, thank you, both these agencies have in writing, policy, dedicated departments, research, outreach, education, awards, different things like that for diversity and inclusion, and they have different focus groups that really want to bring together all the resources possible to facilitate the best environment for women, for minorities, for different folks. Back in the ancient older days, the Navy actually had to turn a ship around when they first integrated, and it was that moment that they said, wow, we need to have a better plan for diversity. And they created the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute called DOME. It's DOME.org, and there's a ton of free materials and resources and things that everybody and anybody can use. And that institute at the time, they said, we'll solve this diversity challenge, then we'll close the institute 6 years. It's still going. But they've transformed from focusing on the problem to focusing on the strengths and the benefits and how we can capitalize off diversity. NASA also does a lot of great awards and different groups, different things to encourage people to be a part of it. And one of the best things I saw when I first got there was our center director said, all right, now I know you may have this habit of going to the people that do good work for you, but think about the people you've never asked. Reach out to them. Reach out to the people who aren't at your table and make sure they're included too. So I think it's not just institutional policy top down, it's also practice and behaviors and things like that. And the last thing I'll share is that when the Navy integrated women back in the day before my time, they actually made it part of evaluations. It wasn't just enough to have them there. They said, not only are we going to have women, you're going to help them succeed, and that's part of your evaluation. And how well you do that for them reflects on you. And I think that's part of why it was successful. And yes, it's taken a long time, and there's still lots to be done, but it's one of the reasons I'm here. And I'm very excited to be a part of it.
So McDonald's has a fairly strong history of employee resource groups, starting with groups that focused on minority issues. I believe our first employee resource group started approximately 40 years ago. And we have groups dedicated to young professionals. We have groups dedicated to staff members we call them crew members in the restaurants who want to go to college. We have volunteer groups, people who work with RMHC, and obviously women's groups. So there is a working parents group, which is predominantly women, but not all women, which is why it changed its name from Working Mothers to Working Parents a few years back. And we also have the Global Women's Leadership Network, which is a collection of people who either are women leaders at McDonald's or who want to be future women leaders at McDonald's. And then with that comes all the associated meetings, social media platforms. Most of us have Facebook groups. The nice thing about working with McDonald's is if you do it right, other people want to copy you. So we like to think that we have an influence above and beyond just, the little McDonald's universe. We have a very, very strong executive support, which is really important. So we'll frequently have chief officers of various divisions speaking at these particular groups. We get together, the Global Women's Leadership Network gets together about once every 2 months, both in person and online. One of the things that we're able to do with a company this size is we can really data mine where are we losing women along the way. We may have 50% representation in one area, but then maybe in the leadership of that area it starts to drop. And then you can really start to drill down into, okay, what can we do to support women more in this area so that the representation stays consistent throughout.
Great, and then I'll talk about this issue more from a macro level. My work for the past year and a half has been at the UN, at the United Nations level, and to see women more engaged in the economy and thus in the leadership of the economy as well, right? And so I think, we take cues and hopefully those cues are then implemented at the government level with various stakeholders, at the corporation level, and then hopefully globally, right? So at the UN, there's this UN Global Compact called Women's Empowering Principles. This is a consortium of companies volunteering to join this consortium, which is now 1,500 companies wide. Those companies include The Gap, which is, local here, Microsoft, and 1,500 others. And they do exactly what you said. They look at best practices, like at McDonald's or NASA, and then they try and sort of, hopefully implement it in their own companies, but they also look to see what else they can do. And this is where the interplay between governments also comes in, because lots of times corrections can't be just done on the ground. They need to come from above, below, from the left and the right, right? So what governments do is also extremely important. And my favorite example there is Canada. When the new Canadian government came in, half of that parliament is women. And he said it has to be, and they nurtured them and they had them in place. So when he came into power, it was 50%. And so you need that, and it's, if I see something, I'm going to do it. So if I'm the president of Ireland or France, right, all these are these very forward-looking, younger leaders of their countries, they're going to do these implementations. And I think so. can we do what's being done? Can we imitate, and can we sort of show the work forward?
All right, that's great. And so now, if you're looking for a job as a woman, and what are some signs that you can look for to indicate that a company or a government or an agency is genuinely committed to increasing diversity? Can you look at interview practices? How do you tell if there's genuine executive support, not just sort of lip service? What kind of specific things could you look for?
I actually had my interns work on this summer, and they came up with a lot of really interesting data to include that the language one uses in your job search, and she compared companies, and I don't want to name names, but she compared different companies and did an analysis of job descriptions, and there's masculine and feminine words, and the more neutral and more balanced, the more inclusive and diverse they would be in other areas, such as when you look at their website, are there multiple different types of folks to look at? Are there people with disability? Are there people of color? Are there LGBT? Are there all these different ways to be diverse? Is that represented right from the go, from your website? And then you go down into the words. How is it the job description advertised? Then you go further into your interview process. Is it focused on, okay, we need this skill with this amount of time engaged in that skill, and this education showing that skill has been acquired, and that's what you focus on. And if you remind folks before you go in the interview, you're less likely to have bias and other things like that. So there's a lot of different things that reflect diversity and that commitment. But it's also, if you go to this company and you look, what do the tables at lunch look like? Are they same groups? Are they mixed and diverse? Are they welcoming? Different things like that. And I think, again, it's from that surface level and narrowing down to the day-to-day interactions and things like that, where you're going to see if they really care or if it's just trying to stay out of trouble kind of thing with the law. So there's a lot, and it's exciting to see a place in a company and a government that cares, and maybe one person doesn't, but it doesn't mean the whole entity doesn't. So it's important to look at the big picture and see how, as a whole, everyone's contributing or not.
So when I'm looking for a job, which I haven't actually recently, the first thing I do is I look at the makeup of the board of directors, because, as I mentioned, it's my personal opinion that executive support is really strong, and I think you can see through the makeup of the board, are they, putting their money where their mouth is, basically, for lack of a better phrase. I also look at comments that ex-employees have made on websites like Glassdoor, where you're going to get a pretty frank assessment. It's almost like being able to peek into people's exit interviews and find out, what is it that made them happy, what is it that made them unhappy, why did they leave. As Legia mentioned, especially at large companies, it could be that one department's not so great, but the department that you're applying to might be fine. I don't necessarily avoid companies that don't meet my expectations, because I think that that's a challenge and an opportunity to go in there and make things better, as long as you're going into it, with that particular perspective.
Yeah, and just sort of from a macro viewpoint, I don't think companies intentionally said, we're going to be discriminatory, right? It never was like that. It's nurture, right? It's happened. And so what I think is, in the last 10 years, we've seen a shift. We're slowly trying to correct that deficit, right? And I also think we need to keep in mind that while we might have the luxury of saying, wow, is this company going to be good for me? I'm a woman, I'm of color, or whatever most people just want to get a job, right? And they don't have access to knowing the board of directors, or right? They don't. I mean, they just want to get a job. And so my sense is that whenever things happen in Silicon Valley, the focus of the world's, what's happening in Silicon Valley then sort of gets copied around or looked around. So because we're addressing gender in a very spotlighty way right now in Silicon Valley, I'm hoping that that'll improve everywhere. But also, I think the world is slowly saying, yeah, I mean, what have we been doing, right? And so they're slowly moving.
So I noticed that that all of you have, in many of your answers, you haven't just talked about women. You've also talked about other, LGBT. You've talked about racial diversity, all in the same bucket. And I think one of the questions people often ask is are policies that are just targeting women, are those actually the effective policies, or do they actually tend to solidify the idea that women are different, that women need help? All of these things, these sort of subtle things that sometimes tend to make the white men, not to offend any of the white men, but to have them, make them want to kind of dig in and can protect their positions. But rather, if we treat all of these issues as general equity issues, whether it's women or men, whether you're gay or you're straight, or whether you're Latino or white or African, that those are actually the policies that tend to be the most effective. And so one of the things, but one of the things I'm really curious about is what your experience has been, whether women-targeted programs are really effective or whether it's better to just think about equity. And but before let me, just a really quick thing, only because I was at a panel, actually I was at a panel of NASA female astronauts about a year ago, and one of the things I thought was really interesting at that panel was that when the astronauts were asked what are the most challenging things about being a woman and an astronaut, their answers were uniformly knowing that I have good childcare at home, knowing that I have emotional support at home, because it's hard to be in space, right? And for a moment I thought, wow, that's terrible. All these women are astronauts. We've come this far, and still their concerns have to be about childcare. And then I realized that it's not about a women. It's not a women's issue. It's actually an astronaut's issue. It's a family issue. And so that's one of the things I think we sometimes come up against. So please.
I'd like to address that. So the burden of care has always been on women, right? From the time of Eve, the burden of care has been on women. And what we're seeing is people are actually recognizing that that's work that we pay, that we should be paying for, and that there should be some compensation for people who do it. So if your nanny is doing that work, you're paying her, but if you're doing that work, you are not getting paid, right? Those are the nuances. So at a global level, we need to correct that, to recognize that, right. It's just work. And I've known men who are so impressed with Roomba, because now doing the floor is no problem, right? So anything that's automated helps everybody, right? And so I think we're going that way. But to answer your question, yes, policies that say that you should have a 50% board that's women, or 50% employees that are women, or 50% they work because nobody is just going to do something because it's the right thing. Sometimes you need the whip, right? Let me give you a really, really good example. And this is why the director of the World Bank is my new idol. I don't know her that well, but with what she did, she is my new idol. So the IMF, right, the International Monetary Fund, gives loans money to countries around the world with different criteria than the World Bank. And Egypt was one of those countries, that was in that position. And Christine Lagarde said, yes, you can have this money with the condition that when you put it into economic initiatives, that half that money will be targeted to women, and so half the women will be half the recipients of that grant, or that is like, do your work at that very high level, and you can't go back because the money is tied to that. And I think policies like that open up people's eyes to say, we got to do it. And then the nature and nurture thing is completely true, right? Yesterday at the gala, Vinod Khosla, right, from Khosla Ventures, said that studies have shown, and he named a study, and I can't remember what it is, but it's a pretty well-known study, and it said that nature has everything to do with the fact that there aren't enough women in STEM. There are no biological things, but the thing is, nurture, not nature. Nurture has everything to do with it. And the thing is, it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because then if you keep telling girls you're not good at math, then they'll internalize it and say, oh, I guess we're not good at math, right? And so that nurture part is super important. But there's really, other than some physical parts, there is nothing different really from men and women.
I think policies that benefit women benefit everybody. If you help a woman at work, you're going to help her family. And this was a recent example of my phone was acting up and causing lots of issues, and it had to get fixed. And my spouse was like, oh, thank heavens, it's finally fixed. You're not angry about it. Bad example, but still. There are a lot of policies that will influence everyone when you bring folks up, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep an eye out for everybody, because it is easy to get lost. And not everyone's issues are represented, and there are things that are very particular to that body. For example, one area of interest that the Navy had looked at was freezing eggs, because there are biology, time limits, and different things. And there's a direct cross between when you go up for this particular position and fertility and things like that. And they said, okay, if we take that out of the equation so that you don't have to worry, you still have the chance to have kids and be at that right time and place for promotion, would that help your career? And so research like that, I think, is just so tremendous, and you're going to help everyone by doing that. But that is very specific to the biology of that person. So I think that nursing rooms, parent leave for all the parents, and other programs are very helpful, and they're not just women's issues. Men need to know, hey, here's your nursing room, here's this, here's that, should you need it. Not that you have to, but not that you don't. So I think these are for everybody, and it helps everyone. If you're a guy with a sister, mom, woman, whatnot, at work, you want the best for her too.
So I think a lot of us are, for lack of a better phrase, hyphenated, okay? I am a disabled woman. My daughter is a deaf Asian LGBT woman. So especially when these are innate things that you can't change, just focusing on the woman piece doesn't necessarily get you where you need to be, because you also need to look at the disabled piece and all the other pieces. So the phrase that I frequently use at work is, this is one situation where a rising tide doesn't necessarily raise all boats, and that we don't want women to be seen as succeeding at the expense of the other groups. So I think under some circumstances, yes, quotas and policies that are specific to women can be helpful, both directly and indirectly, as Ligia pointed out, but that they can't be the sole focus.
It's a really interesting issue, and I'm really glad to have heard some of the things that you have observed. So we have only about 5 minutes left for this panel. I'm afraid this is a huge topic, and we can barely touch the surface. Does anyone have any questions? Should we open it up? Okay.
Hi, that was a lovely talk. Thank you so much. So I wanted to kind of move beyond just the company sphere and ask about, often like a leadership of a company or a CEO, their actions are often on or off the job signal their commitment to diversity. Like I think of like Mark Benioff of Salesforce. I mean, he openly went and took a stand against, for example, legislations in Indiana and Georgia. He marched in the Women's March. So often I feel people in the leadership positions are often compelled to take stands publicly, especially in today's context. I was curious about your opinions, because that's a delicate balance. Have you guys or people in leadership positions in your company, have you felt that pressure? How do you deal with it? How do you navigate the very, very delicate balance of making public stands, but also being conscious of the fact that your companies are diverse, people with diverse opinions too? So I'd love to have thoughts on that. Thank you.
In my experience, I think I read somewhere that people respond differently. Some need to have an emotional appeal. Some need to have a what's in it for them. Some need to have facts. And if you know what your leadership style is, then you can come to them with, here are the facts of how you will be perceived if you support this event on this weekend. For example, our center director marched in the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade, I think 2 years ago, and that was huge to so many people that he stepped up and marched with everyone. So I think that for him it was a, hey, this is the right thing to do, you know, it's going to be great, and things like that. I think it's a question I hear a lot of, how do we influence our leadership? And influence is, again, I think to some extent a strategy of, okay, do I need to appeal to your feelings of how do you feel about this? How can we influence that? Or here's facts to back up feelings, or you want more product, more bottom line, more market. Pepsi is a huge, great example of that. They brought in diversity and their profits soared. So I think that there's plenty of facts and figures and reputable, good places to get that. Using it targeted and being very precise in how you do it can help.
So at McDonald's, anytime that I'm promoting a new initiative pertaining to accessibility, I take a three-prong approach, which I think is very similar to what Lygia just described. I always start with it's the right thing to do, because McDonald's is known for the most part for doing the right things in social initiatives. The second is frequently legal-based, about why certain laws or regulations in particular places would be promoted by doing whatever it is that I am proposing. And then the third thing is, what are the business aspects of it that make sense? So the disability community is 18% of the population. You don't want to exclude 18% of your business potential off the top. In doing initiatives that promote diversity, you're going to be reducing turnover. There is a significant cost to reducing turnover that is sometimes hidden that people don't realize, and if you can tease that out, you can make a really good tangible business argument for what it is that you're trying to accomplish.
And again, I'll speak from a macro level, but I have to tell you that, individual leaders can do individual things, like you pointed out, Mark Benioff. But for me, and in these very interesting times that we live in, I think that I am reassured by what so many leaders are doing, and they're doing it publicly, they're doing it on social media. So when I see Jack, Jack from Twitter, liking something or retweeting something that's either civil rights or diversity-based, etc., I think I'm good. I think if the leadership is showing that. So Mark Benioff, Jack, when I heard that Sergey was at the airport, when I was at the airport, which, by the way, I've never been an activist, but I was at the airport, in January, it made me reassured. It made me feel that Silicon Valley is the place I want to be to go forward. And then when Sundar Pichai came to the Technovation event to respond to the Google memo, that made me sit up so straight, right? And so ready to go the next day and say, you know something, I can program the heck out of this, right? So those leadership, small or big acts speak volumes across sort of the area.
So I'm very sorry that we are out of time. There's so many things that we didn't get to talk about. We didn't even get to touch on the way that things like the McDonald's programs in the workplace around the world affect the way change happens. McDonald's and many companies, affects the way that change happens around the world. So I think our speakers are available to talk to individually at the end of the panel. If you have questions, please do feel free to come up and ask them. And thank you for all these wonderful speakers and for all that they were able to share with us today.